Many Christians struggle to defend the truth of the Christian worldview. But what if there was a podcast dedicated to answering the toughest objections to Christianity? That's the mission of the Daily Apologist podcast. I'm your host, Dean Meadows, and on this episode, I sit down with philosopher Josh Rasmussen to discuss the ontological argument for the existence of God. Ladies and gentlemen, I am here with Dr. Josh Rasmussen. I am extremely honored to be with him. Today, we're going to cover the ontological argument for the existence of God. And so before we get into the actual Q&A, Dr. Rasmussen, for those of us and those people who might be listening who don't know your background, don't know who you are, why don't you go ahead and take a couple of minutes and just give us a brief sketch of who you are, where you studied, and kind of what's your specialty.
Yeah, thanks, Dean. Yeah, it's good to be with you. I'm very excited about this time together. So I teach philosophy. I'm a professor of philosophy at the Azusa Pacific University, and I studied philosophy at the University of Notre Dame. Alvin Plantinga was my advisor after Peter Vannewagen. So I did a dissertation under Peter Vannewagen, and then I actually did some postdoctoral work under Plantinga. And I would say, like, my passion, this is what I keep coming back to, is understanding sort of the most fundamental truths about things. And this applies to the nature of reality. This applies to the nature of your own mind, consciousness. My wife and I will talk all the time about different topics, and it applies to relationships, politics, everything. But the key for me is really to dig to the foundations, because really when you can understand things at a more fundamental level, then you get light that can cast into the more detailed events. It gives you a sense of meaning and an understanding that you might otherwise feel lost. And so that would be kind of my area of focus, is sort of fundamental ontology, or sometimes they just call it metaphysics. I don't like using that word because it's kind of a misnomer. It's not sort of esoteric speculation. It really is a scientific investigation into ultimate reality.
Outstanding. So you are perfect for today's episode, and I can't wait to start digging. So with that, let's go ahead and dig. We've been doing a series, or I've been doing a series. We, as the Daily Apologist, have been doing a series on the ontological argument. And I would argue that this is probably the most misunderstood and hotly debated argument for the existence of God. And so before we go down that line, for our audience, what is the ontological argument? What is ontology? How would you explain that to somebody who maybe has never heard of the ontological argument, doesn't really practice philosophy?
Yeah, I mean, just a preliminary note on its being misunderstood and sort of hotly debated. One of my Facebook friends highlighted the ontological argument as an argument that if you endorse this argument, you sort of lose credibility, because there are other arguments. And this is a non-theist friend who's like, there are other arguments sort of that make me think, like from design or the cosmological argument. The ontological argument sort of looks like you're trying, it's like a trick. You just must care so much about your God existing that you'll resort to this very bad argument. And it's difficult because there's actually a whole family of arguments. There's a cluster of arguments. And it'll be interesting to see how this conversation unfolds, because I'm not like this great defender myself of the ontological argument, although I think it will be helpful to make some distinctions, because there are some pathways within this family that I think might actually be quite promising and worth exploring and even sort of at the edge of my current thought. But as far as like what the argument is, like sort of the basic idea is, you start with the nature of God or the concept of God. So you think of God as like a maximally great being, or a being than which none greater can be conceived, the greatest thinkable being, okay? God is so awesome that you can't even imagine a more awesome being. You start with that concept, and then the basic idea is that you're able to, on reflection, deduce that being must actually exist. And sort of in the original formulation, and we'll get more into this, but just to give a little bit of a feeling for this, it's like, if this great being didn't exist, well, then you could imagine an even greater being, one which has love, power, knowledge, and it actually exists. It's sort of even greater. And so by reflecting on this very nature, this very concept, you can deduce that it must actually exist. That's the basic idea.
Just like the cosmological argument, it's not just one argument, but it's
Yeah.
a family of arguments. There are multiple ontological arguments, just like there are multiple cosmological arguments.
Yeah, or even like an argument strategy. Like it's sort of an investigation from, can you go from the mere nature of God? And I think it's actually helpful for your listeners almost to think of this as an invitation to explore, and as a strategy to investigate. Because I think what happens in the contest of ideas, especially sort of in apologetics forms, people get so quickly into the frame of, is this a good argument or not, that it almost shuts down the curiosity. And so people don't see the complexity. And we'll be unpacking that as we go forward.
Yeah. So I think one of the things we need to do before we go forward is when we understand, we've kind of talked about here briefly in the opening that this is not just one argument, it's a family of arguments. It talks about, the highest conceivable being, a maximally great being. But even before that, when we say it's that God's existence is a matter of ontology, what do we mean by ontology?
Yeah, so that word has to do with being or existence. And I think of it in terms of sort of the nature of things. In the field of metaphysics, there's this field that's sometimes just called ontology, which has to do with being or existence. And that's kind of the basic idea as far as what I think of. Maybe you have even something else in your own mind.
I'm
Yeah.
right in line with you on that. And so when we talk about the ontological argument for God's existence, what's the origin of the ontological argument? When did this argument appear in history, and who's responsible for it? I think that's something also to kind of look at, just to kind of set the table for the ontological argument.
Yeah. So, I mean, I always imagine that for any idea, there are various precursors, various forms. But of course, Anselm is perhaps the most famous one who really articulated some early formulations of the argument that we recognize today. And it's been iterated, and we'll talk about those iterations. But, and he was thinking in the proslogion about this argument that could sort of answer, he calls him the fool, but I don't like that phrase, but the way he's thinking about it is like, if you can show that somebody who says that God does not exist, that person is engaged in a kind of contradiction, because in order to say that God does not exist, you have to at least have the concept of God. In order to deny that God exists, you have to like understand what it is that you're denying. And then his whole strategy was to try to show that from that very concept, if you really understand the concept, then you can deduce a contradiction from denying that concept actually applies in reality.
So just from what I've read, it seems like Anselm has two versions of the ontological argument. Now, I guess my question is, do you think that Anselm succeeded in showing that from the possibility of God, that God actually does exist?
So there's a couple of things that I want to disentangle here. So that's a great question. So first, there's this question about like, how many arguments can you find in his own work? And like, what are those arguments? I actually did a review of a book called Anselm's Other Argument. And he was trying to fish out what you might call a third version of the argument. And so he was saying that this was sort of like implicit in what Anselm was thinking. And the reason why I want to kind of start here with interpretation is that I want to be very careful about like being confident in saying that I know what Anselm's arguments are in their best form. And so I'm just going to speak from my own perspective. As far as the arguments that I've seen from him, so far I've not been able to unpack them in a way that I can see would be compelling to me if I didn't already believe in God.
There you go. Yeah.
Okay. And I'm just saying that from my own perspective. Okay. And people can maybe have a different assessment, but a standard evaluation of Anselm's argument kind of goes like this. When we try to make his argument rigorous and we put it into a logical formulation, we use first order predicate logic, for example, or even second order. We make it rigorous. We give it a formulation that is precise. Then it looks like in one formulation, when you start talking about God is the being than which none greater can be conceived, that word God, either it picks out something, in which case that very first premise looks like it's presupposing the conclusion, because it's presupposing that the word God actually picks out God. God is the being than which none greater can be conceived, or it picks out a concept.
Mm-hmm.
And so you try to work this out precisely, and then the worry is that, well, if it picks out a concept, it's not clear how you can deduce the conclusion that this concept, I mean, the concept does exist in reality. I have the concept.
Uh-huh.
The question is what the concept is actually about? Does that exist in reality? And so if we really get this clear, we work it out. Now, let me just be clear, because I sort of think of the ontological argument in sort of three iterations. There's Anselm's original formulation, then there's a kind of updated formulation that your listeners will probably recognize in terms of Plantinga's modal ontological argument.
Yeah.
And then even after that, there's Gödelian versions of the argument. And you could actually think of these iterations as making clear and more precise the best form of Anselm's argument. And so when I say I'm not like convinced by the original form, I mean in its original form without updating it in these particular ways.
You're essentially saying like the original form of how Anselm constructed his argument isn't necessarily convincing, but that doesn't mean that you're not convinced by these other quote updates or
that there couldn't be a convincing version. Yeah.
So with that, let's go ahead and move along. As we look at some of those iterations, it's one of my friends. We have a couple of guys on the team at the Daily Apologist. One of my friends, Forrest Antimasaurus, this will now be the second time that I've referenced him, because I was very skeptical of the ontological argument and have become convinced of it. And so he's like, you owe me 10,000 apologies. Well, he was talking with a buddy of mine, also Nathan Liddell, and they were asking the question, does the ontological argument work? And my buddy Nathan said, well, if Anselm's original argument worked, why would there need to be a modal ontological argument? Which was kind of the kind of like the jab at Forrest, who's the ontological argument guy on the team. And so with that, we do see this iteration that comes to fruition through Alvin Plantinga, the modal ontological argument. So kind of unpack for us, for our listeners, what's the big difference between Anselm's argument and Plantinga's modal ontological argument?
Yeah, so this is how I think of the different, and I mean, each of these questions, different philosophers will perhaps answer them differently, because there is some controversy of like how to tease these things apart. But the way that I think of it is that what Plantinga does is he updates the argument in terms of our latest and best modal logic, which is the logic of possibility and necessity. And he sets up an argument that can be summarized very briefly like this. The greatest possible being is, actually, let me say this differently. Premise one, a maximally great being possibly exists. Premise two, if a maximally great being possibly exists, then a maximally great being actually exists. Therefore, a maximally great being actually exists. And what Plantinga does is he uses the latest modal logic to provide supports for that second premise, that if a maximally great being possibly exists and actually exists, and we can unpack that. And then he defines carefully what he means by maximally great being.
That was going to be my next question, because the listener's going to be like, okay, what in the world what does he mean by maximally great being?
Yeah, and before we get into those, even just like the story of your own thinking is interesting to me. So you that you were kind of initially skeptical and you've been convinced that a version of it works. Would you say like Plantinga's version?
Yeah, I would say I see that if there's an iteration, I'm not familiar with the third that you've mentioned.
Yeah, we'll get to
So I'm
that.
fairly new to the
Yeah.
ontological argument, but I kind of assume the same thing that you talked about with regards to Anselm's first or his original argument, and then Plantinga comes along with the version that you just laid out, and I think he makes a pretty compelling case there. There's still some questions I have, but as far as like, do I lean towards it more being sound rather than unsound? I lean more towards sound. I still have some questions that have recently been raised by a friend of mine on the Daily Apologist team, Nathan Liddell, that I'm hopefully get a chance to ask you. So that's just kind of where I go. I think, with regards to his argument, I think the base point of contention would be the first premise of his argument. Let's go ahead.
Well, and even before we zoom in on that, if I may, just say something that I think a lot of your listeners might resonate with, a certain kind of objection, like to the whole project, which is this feeling that you can't define something into existence. Like you can't, like in principle, just look at the concept of like a unicorn, and by studying that concept, you realize, oh, there actually is a unicorn, like in principle. And this is where I think Plantinga's version helps to kind of break that a little bit, or to reveal some more complexity. If I could just sort of stand back and point to this same kind of reasoning in the philosophy of mathematics or in the philosophy of logic, for example, there are these arguments, and I'm convinced by these arguments for sure, which isn't to say that there isn't a version of that ontological argument that is promising as well, but that you can actually show just by logic itself that logic exists. And the reason for this is because one of the principles of logic is that the principles of logic are necessary. Mm-hmm. And that if necessity entails truth and truth entails existence, that is to say, a something that is true is a something. It's maybe a conceptual something or propositional something. So I actually have this article, a publication called From Necessary Truth to Necessary Existence. And I just want to point to this for your listeners, because I want to show there's more complexity here. Even that initial worry that you couldn't in principle show from the concept of something that actually applies in reality, there are these arguments from the mere concepts of logical inferences to their necessity. It's maybe you might say the concepts are windows into their nature. Maybe that's a better way of putting it. And then once you see their nature, you can deduce from the nature of their necessity, and from necessity to actuality, that logical principles actually exist and necessarily exist out there, like outside of my mind.
So it's not something. What you're saying is then, with regards to the ontological argument, that principle that Plantinga uses is not some foreign concept in the field of whether that's philosophy or mathematics, that it's not something that's strictly kind of a catch-all for proving the ontological argument to be.
That's right. Yes, there's an independent line going from the nature of things to actual existence that's widely recognized. And so here we're just applying that reasoning.
And I don't want to get too far down the line. I really want to return to that idea. But let's kind of go back for a split second before we get there and say, all right, so what does Plantinga mean by maximally great being? Because this is a place where, with my skeptical friends, that there's a lot of conversation about maximally great being. What does that even mean? I recently, there was a friend of mine who is a talk show host at the atheist community of Austin. Her name is Vila Bianca, and she was doing this thing where you have I think it was like hot takes of the week or something like that. And so my first point was episode 3 of Star Wars is better than Rise of Skywalker. And then she said, well, I don't know much about Star Wars. So then I said, kind of to set the conversation, I said, the ontological argument for God's existence works. She goes, I have a lot to say about that.
Mm-hmm.
And so in the middle of that conversation, they said, well, even the idea of a maximally great being is incoherent with regards to some of the features that a maximally great, all-knowing, all-powerful, perfectly moral. There's some idea in there that this is logically incoherent. So what does Plantinga mean by maximally great being, and is that concept incoherent?
So I think I'd have to actually look at his exact formulation, but I think he just lists a bunch of classical attributes: omnipotence, omniscience, moral perfection, and then adds has these in all possible worlds.
Yeah.
And so these are, you might say, excellences, and that a maximally great being is a being that, if it exists, would have all of those excellences. Then, in the way that I think of it, is that there's this core attribute of greatness, or I've been calling it purely positive or perfection, absolute perfection. And it's intuitively related to those excellences, because when you just think about the list of, power, knowledge, goodness, like if you're worshiping a being or praising a being or even just admiring a friend, and you begin to list positive traits, there's something those traits have in common. There's a kind of positivity.
Yeah.
And so I think there is this kind of basic concept of positivity. And I think the best way to draw it out is through examples. One of the things that I'll do sometimes is I'll just tell a story of how I will praise my wife, and I'll tell her how she's so beautiful, she's so awesome, she's just weak, she just can't do anything, and she's so smart. And it's like, which one of those things is not like the other? And people smile because they know calling my wife weak wasn't like in keeping with praise, and yeah. I think even the smile and the giggle, and it always happens that people always smile and they always giggle. I think it shows that intuitively we understand there's this basic concept of positivity or greatness. And so, I mean, I've combed the literature. I can tell you from one who's read the arguments trying to show there's incoherence or incompatibility, that although there are some interesting, I would say, puzzles with respect to certain analyses of certain properties, I have not seen anybody establish an incoherence in the basic, the root concept of pure positivity or absolute perfection. In fact, I think that those analyses, those puzzles, help to sharpen our understanding of what that root concept implies. And I think that there have been some articulations of, let's say, omnipotence, for example, or omniscience that are problematic. But it doesn't mean that there isn't a being that is maximal in knowledge, maximal in power. It just means that if you analyze maximal knowledge or maximal power in these particular ways, then that's going to be problematic. But there are other analyses that aren't problematic. Or, even if, and I haven't seen that this has been done, but even if every attempt at analysis has a problem, that still doesn't show that the original root concept is problematic. And so I think that's an important distinction that has to be made here.
No, I think that's a very good point to be made with regards to the analysis of a maximally great being and how we either study that maximally great being or how we analyze those attributes. Great insight there on the ontological argument, Dr. Rasmussen. Thank you so much for coming on the show today. I cannot wait to continue our discussion next week as we enter into part 2. And for our listeners, as always, head on over to thedailyapologist.com, check out the new blogs, check out our social media platforms. There's some videos also on the website that you don't want to miss. And don't forget to support the Apologetics Report run by Forrest Antimasaris. If you can't find your apologetics news there, it does not exist. And on behalf of Dr. Rasmussen, I'm Dean Meadows signing off. And remember, equip yourself to engage culture.